Some of the biggest stories out there aren't the ones you see in the headlines every day. They're the ones that are just kind of simmering in silence for decades. And then, boom, one single event just changes everything. We're about to dive into one of those stories, a political reality that was intentionally ignored for over 30 years.
So, over in the Horn of Africa, there was this political reality that the world it intentionally ignored it for over 30 years. It was almost like this unspoken agreement, Let's just all look the other way. But that long diplomatic silence, it has just been shattered.
All right, so let's dig into this. How does a silence that's lasted for 30 years suddenly get broken like that?
Well, in December 2025, Israel went and did something no other UN member state had dared to do in over 3 decades. It formally recognized Somaliland as a sovereign state. Yeah, after 34 years of just existing in this diplomatic gray zone, a major country was finally forced to pick a side.
And this really gets to the core of the whole problem, right? For decades, you look at any official world map and you see one country, Somalia. But if you were actually on the ground in the northern part of that country, you'd see something totally different. You'd see Somaliland, a place with its own government, its own currency, its own security forces. A country in literally everything but name.
So how does that even happen, right? How do you end up with 2 completely different realities on the very same map? To figure that out, we've got to rewind a bit and look at how this whole division started in the first place. Okay, so it all kicks off back in 1960. You had the former British Somaliland in the north and Italian Somaliland in the south, and they decided to unite to form the Somali Republic. It was supposed to be this huge moment of hope and unity. But one source we looked at put it perfectly, calling it a rushed, poorly negotiated marriage. And believe me, the cracks started showing almost right away. And you can see exactly how things went south right here. Power pretty quickly got centralized in the south, down in Mogadishu. Then, after a military coup in 1969, all that resentment building in the north just boiled over into open rebellion. The government's response? It was brutal. It led to this devastating civil war in the 80s. So, you can imagine, when the central government finally collapsed in 1991, the leaders up north saw their chance, not to rebuild Somalia, but to get out.
And look, it is impossible to overstate the impact of that war. This wasn't just some political disagreement. We're talking about cities being bombed by their own government. For so many people in the north, that violence permanently severed any sense of belonging to the Somali state. For them, there was just no going back.
So after 1991, even though they were still technically one country on paper, on the map, Somalia and Somaliland started walking down 2 completely different, almost opposite paths.
The contrast here is just staggering. While southern Somalia was descending into decades of civil war and total chaos, Somaliland did the exact opposite. They rebuilt from the ground up, bottom up. They established peace and built a functional democracy that has held multiple elections. A completely different story. So, after all that work, after building a stable, democratic state in one of the world's most volatile regions, what was their big reward from the international community? A big fat zero. For over 30 years, not a single UN member state officially recognized them. Nothing.
Which, of course, brings us to the central question of this whole entire story. If Somaliland was for all intents and purposes functioning as a state, why did the rest of the world just refuse to call it one?
Well, it really boils down to this one major principle, especially for the African Union, the idea of inviolable borders. Basically, it's the belief that the borders drawn up by colonial powers, as messy and problematic as they are, should not be changed. The fear was, and still is, that if you change one border, you could open a total Pandora's box of independence movements all across the continent.
And that right there created the core dilemma. What do you do? Do you reward Somaliland for creating stability against all odds, or do you uphold the international rulebook that's supposed to prevent wider chaos? For decades, the world chose the rulebook, every single time.
But now, Israel's recognition in 2025 has completely upended that status quo. It took this frozen, intentionally ignored conflict and just threw it right back onto the world stage for everyone to see.
And whoa, the backlash was immediate and fierce. Somalia, obviously, called it an illegal violation of its sovereignty. But they were not alone. The African Union, the Arab League, and all the neighboring countries, they all lined up to condemn the move and double down on their support for a unified Somalia.
And this also created a really dangerous new dynamic on the ground.
The militant group al-Shabaab, which is already fighting the government in Mogadishu, immediately jumped on this. They're using the recognition as a huge propaganda tool, framing it as, foreign interference and an attack on Muslim lands, which is an incredibly powerful message for recruitment.
And this, right here, is maybe the most important takeaway from this whole story. For 30 years, the world tried to avoid making a choice. But the silence was a choice. It was an action in itself that just locked in the status quo, and it had very real consequences for millions of people. It was never neutral.
So now, that long silence is broken. The old policy of just looking the other way? Well, that's just not an option anymore. And whether Israel's move was a one-off thing or the first domino to fall, the world is now being forced to confront the very question it ignored for decades. What happens when the maps no longer match the reality on the ground?